The year is 1933, in the heart of rural Louisiana, where the dust of the Great Depression settles on everything like a fine layer of despair. A small town fair attempts to defy the era's crushing weight. The air is thick with the scent of dry earth, cheap tobacco, and the forced optimism of a community holding on to its traditions by a thread. Children chase each other through clouds of ochre dust, their laughter a fragile sound against the backdrop of silent, worried parents. It is a scene of profound Americana, a portrait of resilience painted in muted colors. Here, in this public square, neighbors gather not just for commerce, but for a shared moment of respite, a collective illusion that for one afternoon, the world outside this pocket of strained festivity has ceased to exist. They seek comfort in the familiar, and in the center of it all, one particular aroma offers more than just sustenance. It offers a promise of stability in a world that has none. Drifting above the murmur of the crowd and the tinny music of a distant calliope is a scent so compelling it borders on the divine. It is savory, rich, and deeply meaty, laced with the subtle warmth of southern spices, a fragrance that cuts through the hardship of the day and speaks directly to the hollow ache of hunger. This aroma originates from a single, immaculately clean stall, the most popular attraction at the fair, presided over by Miss Eliza May. A long, patient line of townsfolk snakes away from her counter, each person clutching a few precious coins, their eyes fixed on the golden brown meat pies, sizzling in a cast-iron skillet. In a time of scarcity, Miss Eliza May's pies were not just food. They were an affordable miracle, a taste of prosperity that had become a distant memory for so many. Her success was the town's pride, a testament to the enduring spirit of one of their own. Behind the counter stands Eliza May herself, a figure of unimpeachable grace. Dressed in a modest, dark dress with her hair pinned neatly in a bun, she moves with an economy of motion that speaks of years of hard work. She offers each customer a gentle, pious smile, her voice a soft southern melody as she wishes them God's blessings with every purchase. She is the quintessential widow, resilient and devout, a woman who seemingly turned her personal tragedy into a source of communal strength. But for those who might look closer, who could hold her gaze for more than a fleeting moment, there is something else. Beneath the veneer of warm hospitality, her eyes hold an unnerving, icy calm, a placid stillness that seems entirely disconnected from the bustling scene around her. It is the dispassionate gaze of an artisan focused solely on her craft, or perhaps on something else entirely. To understand the legend of Eliza May, one must first understand the landscape of 1933. This was an era of ghosts. Men, broken by unemployment and shame, became drifters, riding the rails from one town to the next in search of work that did not exist. They were rootless, anonymous figures who could vanish without a trace, their absence noted by no one. In this chaotic environment, authority was thin and often indifferent. A local sheriff, burdened with problems of poverty and petty crime, had little time or inclination to investigate the disappearance of an outsider who was likely just another soul moving on down the line. This pervasive anonymity provided a perfect cover. In a world where life had become terrifyingly cheap, the disappearance of a man without a name was not a mystery. It was simply a Tuesday. This backdrop of desperation and neglect was the soil in which Eliza May's dark enterprise would take root and flourish. Today, the story of Eliza May's meat pies is no longer a cherished memory of communal survival. It is curdled into something else entirely, a dark chapter in the town's oral history, a cautionary tale whispered to misbehaving children. The stall, once a symbol of hope, is now remembered as a stage for an unspeakable deception. The very thing that brought the community together, the delicious, affordable meal that filled their stomachs during the leanest of years, was built upon a foundation of profound horror. For hidden within the flaky crust and the savory, spiced filling was a gruesome secret, an ingredient sourced not from any local farm or butcher, but from the shadows of desperation that surrounded the town. The people of this Louisiana parish were consuming more than just a pie. They were unwittingly partaking in a monstrous act of commerce, their hunger sated by the very men the Depression had erased from the world. The truth transformed an icon of resilience into a local bogeyman. What was once a tale of a hardworking widow triumphing over adversity became a grotesque legend of culinary horror. The irresistible aroma that once defined the town fair is now recalled with a collective shudder, a sensory ghost that haunts the descendants of those who stood in that long, eager line. The official records are sparse, buried in dusty archives, but the story itself has proven far more durable, passed down through generations. It serves as a chilling reminder of the thin veil that separates civilization from savagery, and how easily the mundane can become the macabre. It poses an unsettling question that lingers in the humid Louisiana air. How well can you ever truly know your neighbor? And what secrets might be simmering just beneath the surface of a friendly smile? This legend is an echo that endures, a story that travels through time to find us here today. And since these histories journey across decades, tell us in the comments from which city you are joining us in this investigation, and at what exact time. With your presence now marked in our records, we can return to the past, to that dusty Louisiana square in 1933. We will uncover how the first crack appeared in Eliza May's perfect facade, how the quiet disappearance of a few forgotten men began to coalesce into a pattern too disturbing for one outsider to ignore. The aroma of the pies still hangs in the air, but soon, another, more sinister scent will begin to rise. In the light of day, Eliza May's life was a portrait of quiet fortitude, a testament to the virtues espoused every Sunday from the pulpit of the First Baptist Church. Her routine was as predictable as the tolling of the church bell. Mornings were for prayer and preparation, her small, tidy kitchen filling with the scent of rising dough and simmering spices. Afternoons were for business at the fair, where her stall became a beacon of affordable comfort. Evenings were for scripture and solitude. She was a fixture in the community's fabric, contributing generously to the church bake sales, though never with her famous meat pies, and offering a kind word to every soul she met. Her piety was her armor, a flawless exterior that deflected both pity and suspicion. To the townsfolk, she was not merely a survivor, she was a symbol of divine grace in the face of hardship, a woman who had turned her personal sorrow into a source of public sustenance. Her status as a widow afforded her a peculiar kind of reverence. Several of the town's more prosperous bachelors and widowers had attempted to court her, drawn by her quiet dignity and surprising financial success. Eliza May would politely, almost sorrowfully, decline each advance. She would lower her eyes, a gesture of practiced humility, and speak of her undying love for her late husband, a man she claimed had vanished years ago, heading west in a desperate search for work. "My heart is buried with him, wherever his resting place may be," she would murmur, her voice catching with just enough emotion to be convincing. The town saw this as tragic loyalty, the mark of a truly devoted wife. They did not see the cold, pragmatic calculation behind the performance. A new husband would mean questions, shared finances, and a loss of the absolute control she wielded over her home and her grim enterprise. Her solitude was not a prison, it was a fortress. Into this closed, self-regulating world stepped Agent Thomas Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He arrived on a train from Washington, D.C. in early October of 1933, a man as out of place as a wool suit in the Louisiana humidity. He was young, sharp-featured, and carried with him an air of clinical detachment that the locals found unnerving. His assignment was broad and thankless: to investigate a series of unconnected missing persons reports across several rural parishes, a task deemed too insignificant for local authorities but a persistent enough statistic to warrant federal attention. Miller was a man of ledgers, timelines, and facts, an apostle of logic in a land that ran on faith and tradition. He did not see a resilient community. He saw a collection of data points, a place where the chaos of the era could easily swallow a man whole, and he was determined to find the pattern in that chaos. His first stop was the office of Sheriff Brody, a portly, complacent man whose approach to law enforcement was more about maintaining peace than pursuing justice. Brody's filing system was a testament to his apathy, a collection of dusty, disorganized folders stuffed into a wooden cabinet. When questioned about the missing drifters, the sheriff simply shrugged. "Son, these are hard times," he drawled, offering Miller a lukewarm coffee. "Men wander. They find a bottle, a woman, or the end of a rope. It ain't a mystery. It's just life." To him, these men were ghosts long before they vanished. their disappearances as natural and unremarkable as the turning of the seasons. He viewed Miller's investigation as a waste of federal money, an outsider's attempt to find a conspiracy where there was only the mundane, grinding tragedy of the Great Depression. He saw no crimes, only consequences. Undeterred by the sheriff's indifference, Agent Miller spent the next 3 days sequestered in a corner of the stuffy office, meticulously poring over every scrap of paper. He ignored the sheriff's dismissive glances and the scent of frying lard that drifted in from the town square, a smell that seemed to permeate everything. He compiled a list of every man reported missing in the parish over the last 3 years, cross-referencing names with railroad logs, post office records, and any other official document he could find. Most of the trails went cold almost immediately, the men dissolving back into the anonymity from which they came. But as he worked, a faint, unsettling thread began to emerge from the tangled mess of forgotten lives. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but to a mind like Miller's, it was a signal in the noise. A pattern was beginning to take shape. The connection was subtle, almost circumstantial. Over a period of 2 years, 3 separate missing persons reports had been filed for transient workers. The first was a man named Henry Gable, a former farmhand from Arkansas. The second, Jacob Reed, a rail rider from Missouri. The third, a man known only as Silas, who had been drifting south from Tennessee. On the surface, they had nothing in common but their transient status and the fact that they had all disappeared without a word. But Miller's methodical review of Sheriff Brody's casually taken notes revealed one shared detail. In the days leading up to their disappearances, each of the 3 men had been renting a room for a modest price. They had all found temporary lodging in the same small, respectable house on the edge of town, the home of the pious and hardworking widow, Miss Eliza May. This discovery was, at first, nothing more than a statistical anomaly. Eliza May was known to occasionally rent her spare room to men passing through, an act of Christian charity that also provided a small, odd, respectable income. No one in town thought anything of it. It was simply another example of her resourcefulness and kind heart. The men would stay for a week or 2, enjoy her famous hospitality, and then move on, presumably following the elusive promise of work elsewhere on the line. Their departures were as quiet and expected as their arrivals. The town was a brief stop, a moment of respite, and Eliza May was the kindly face they saw before they continued their journey. The idea that their journey ended within the walls of her home was utterly inconceivable. Why would anyone suspect the woman who fed them? Agent Miller, however, was immune to the town's collective adoration of its local saint. He operated on evidence, not sentiment, and the evidence pointed, however faintly, toward her doorstep. It was too coincidental. 3 men, all outsiders with no local ties, all vanishing from the same boarding house. While the sheriff saw a series of unfortunate, unrelated events, Miller saw a potential locus of activity. He began to observe Eliza May from a distance, watching her at the fair. He saw the gentle smile, the pious demeanor, the long line of grateful customers. He noted the meticulous cleanliness of her stall and the efficient, almost mechanical way she worked. And he saw her eyes, that same icy, dispassionate calm that others mistook for grace. He recognized as something else, a profound and unsettling emptiness. He began his inquiries discreetly, speaking to neighbors under the guise of a routine follow-up. The response was uniform and immediate. Miss Eliza May was a pillar of the community, a God-fearing woman who wouldn't harm a fly. They spoke of her kindness, her resilience, her delicious pies. The more they defended her, the more Miller's suspicion grew. Their praise was a wall, a fortress of public opinion built around the woman, protecting her from any form of scrutiny. They described the drifters who stayed with her as quiet, temporary figures who came and went. No one recalled anything unusual about their departures. No one had even noticed they were gone until Miller asked. The community's perception of Eliza May was so powerful it rendered her invisible to suspicion, allowing her to operate in plain sight. The initial phase of the investigation concluded not with a breakthrough, but with a deepening sense of dread for Agent Miller. He had no tangible proof, only a disturbing pattern and a growing intuition that the savory aroma wafting from the town square was masking something deeply foul. The sheriff was a dead end, and the town was a willing accomplice in its own ignorance. Miller was alone. an outsider looking in at a perfect picture of Southern life, convinced that if he scratched at the surface, he would find an unimaginable horror festering underneath. He knew that the truth, if it existed, was not in any official file. It was hidden somewhere behind Eliza May's pious smile, buried deep within the soil of her quiet, unassuming property on the edge of town. The fragile normalcy of the town was destined to be shattered not by a grand confession or a dramatic confrontation, but by the idle curiosity of a child. On a crisp October afternoon, a young boy named Samuel chased his scruffy terrier through the dense woods that bordered Eliza May's property. The air was filled with the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves, a wholesome, earthy perfume that stood in stark contrast to the cloying, savory aroma that often drifted from the nearby kitchen. For Samuel, these woods were a kingdom of adventure, a place of imaginary forts and hidden treasures. He was entirely unaware that he was playing on the edge of a graveyard, one whose markers were not stones, but the roots of ancient cypress trees. The innocence of the scene was a delicate veneer, a thin layer of topsoil over a profound and meticulously concealed darkness, about to be disturbed by the frantic paws of a loyal dog. The terrier, whose name has been lost to the town's memory, suddenly broke from the chase and began digging furiously at the base of a large, gnarled oak tree. Its whining was sharp, its paws sending clumps of dark, damp earth flying. Samuel, laughing at the dog's single-minded intensity, assumed it had cornered a rabbit or smelled a mole's tunnel. He knelt beside the growing hole, encouraging the animal with playful words. But as the dog dug deeper, it uncovered something that was not a root or a stone. It was a bone, unnaturally white against the black soil. Samuel's initial amusement faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. The bone was thick, and at one end, it was not snapped cleanly but splintered in a way that suggested a heavy, deliberate blow from a sharp implement. It was a detail a child could not comprehend, but one his instincts registered as profoundly wrong. Beside the bone, half buried in the loose dirt, something metallic glinted in the dappled sunlight. Forgetting the strange bone for a moment, Samuel's boyish fascination with treasure took over. He reached into the shallow pit and pulled the object free, rubbing the caked mud from its surface with his small thumb. It was a belt buckle, heavy and made of tarnished silver. The craftsmanship was intricate, depicting a soaring eagle with its wings outstretched, a design far more elaborate than anything worn by the local farmers. It was the kind of possession a man might cherish, a small piece of his identity he carried with him on a long and lonely road. The boy held the two objects in his hands, a splintered piece of a forgotten man and the last symbol of his existence, and the quiet woods suddenly felt cold and menacing, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. A strange intuition, the kind that often guides the young and the innocent, steered Samuel away from his own home. He knew, without knowing why, that his parents would dismiss his findings. They would tell him to throw the dirty bone back and that the buckle was just some lost piece of junk. But there was another presence in town, an outsider who seemed to traffic in secrets and whispers. He had seen Agent Miller, the serious man in the dark suit, speaking to people in hushed tones, his notebook always open. Samuel clutched the buckle and the bone, their cold weight a secret in his pocket, and made his way not to the comfort of his own porch, but toward the boarding house where the federal man was staying. He was acting on a gut feeling that these objects were not merely found things. They were evidence, clues in a mystery that the adults around him had failed to even notice was unfolding. Agent Miller was in his rented room, surrounded by a sea of paperwork under the weak glow of a single bulb, when the soft knock came at his door. He found the small boy on his threshold, looking up at him with a mixture of fear and determination. Samuel presented his findings without a word, laying the muddy buckle and the splintered bone on Miller's desk. The agent's initial reaction was one of mild annoyance, the interruption of a professional by a child's game. But as he examined the items, his focus sharpened, the air in the room growing still and heavy. He picked up the buckle, his fingers tracing the outline of the eagle. The design was specific, almost identical to a detail he had read just hours before in a dusty file, a small note made by a distant sheriff in another state about the personal effects of a missing man. The boy had not brought him a trinket. He had brought him the first tangible link in a chain of ghosts. The file belonged to Henry Gable, the former farmhand from Arkansas. one of the 3 transients who had vanished after staying with Eliza May. The report, filed by Gable's estranged sister, had mentioned her brother's one prized possession, a silver eagle-crested belt buckle he had won in a rodeo competition years ago. Miller felt a cold, electric thrill pass through him, the grim satisfaction of a theorist whose abstract hypothesis has just been proven by physical fact. This was no longer a pattern on a piece of paper. This was a piece of a victim, unearthed from a shallow, unmarked grave on the very edge of the suspect's property. The boy's discovery had dragged the investigation out of the realm of statistical anomaly and into the chilling reality of a homicide. The quiet, pious widow was no longer just a person of interest. She was now the center of a murder inquiry. Miller then turned his attention to the bone. While he was not a medical examiner, his federal training had included basic forensic analysis. He noted the size and density, consistent with a human femur, but it was the splintering at the end that held his gaze. The damage was not the work of an animal's teeth, nor was it a clean break from an accident. The sharp, jagged edges and deep scores in the bone were indicative of a heavy cleaver, the kind a butcher would use to break down a carcass. The image that flashed through his mind was so grotesque, so unthinkable, that he had to consciously push it away. The bone did not just suggest murder, it suggested a methodical, utilitarian dismemberment. It suggested that the victim had been processed, like livestock, for a purpose Miller did not yet dare to name. Armed with this horrifying new evidence, Agent Miller went directly to Sheriff Brody's office. He laid the buckle and the bone on the sheriff's cluttered desk, explaining the connection to the Henry Gable file with cold, clipped precision. Brody stared at the objects, his face a mask of weary disbelief. He picked up the buckle, turned it over in his hand, and tossed it back down. A buckle, Miller, and a piece of what is probably deer bone a dog dug up, he scoffed, his voice thick with condescension. You're going to accuse a God-fearing woman, a pillar of this community, based on the treasure hunt of a little boy. You city folk have a wild imagination. For Brody, the alternative, that the woman who served him pie every Sunday was a killer, was simply too monstrous to contemplate. It was easier to believe Miller was wrong. The sheriff's dismissal was the final confirmation for Miller that he was operating in hostile territory. Brody was not just complacent, he was an obstacle, a guardian of a status quo that protected a predator. He warned Miller to stop harassing the townsfolk, especially Miss Eliza May, threatening to file a complaint with his superiors in Washington. Leave it alone, son, Brody said, his tone a mix of fatherly advice and a veiled threat. You're chasing shadows where there's only hardship. But Miller was not deterred. He was galvanized. The sheriff's refusal to act gave him the moral authority to proceed on his own. The formal investigation had now truly begun, not with the sanction of local law, but in direct defiance of it. He knew the truth was hidden in Eliza May's house, and he would have to find a way inside. The discovery in the woods had irrevocably altered the fabric of the investigation. A child's game had unearthed a man's final testament, transforming Agent Miller's quiet suspicions into a concrete and terrifying reality. The tarnished silver buckle and the splintered bone were no longer just objects. They were a silent accusation, pointing directly toward the small, tidy house on the edge of town. While the community slept, wrapped in the false comfort of Eliza May's charity and the savory aroma of her pies, Miller began to plan his next move. The time for discreet inquiries was over. To uncover the full, unspeakable scope of her operation, he would have to breach the walls of her fortress, a place where piety was the lock and the town's adoration was the key. He had to get inside her kitchen. Agent Miller's formal inquiries began not with a battering ram, but with a series of polite, fruitless conversations. He moved from one weathered porch to the next, speaking to the neighbors who lived in the orbit of Eliza May's quiet home. The response was a unified chorus of disbelief and indignation. They described her as a pillar of Christian virtue, a woman whose piety was as well known as the savory aroma of her pies. Accuse Miss Eliza May? One man scoffed, cleaning a shotgun on his front steps. You might as well accuse the preacher of sinning. She is the soul of this town. Each defense was a brick in a wall of denial, a fortress of public perception that seemed impenetrable. Miller meticulously recorded their testimonies, recognizing that Eliza May's greatest weapon was not a cleaver or a poison, but the unshakable faith of her community. Her goodness had become an accepted, unexamined fact. The defense of Eliza May went beyond simple admiration. It was a form of self-preservation for the town itself. In an era defined by chaos and moral decay, she represented an anchor of stability and grace. To admit that something was profoundly wrong with her would be to admit that the darkness they all feared had not been kept at bay, but had been invited into their homes, served on a plate, and celebrated as a miracle. Her neighbors were not just defending a woman. They were defending their own fragile sense of order. Agent Miller realized he was not fighting a single suspect, but the collective will of a town desperate to believe in a simple, comforting lie. Their loyalty was a form of mass delusion, a powerful opiate against the harsh realities of their time, and he was the unwelcome voice of sobriety. Frustrated by the town's willful blindness and stonewalled by Sheriff Brody, Miller understood that a conventional investigation was impossible. He was an outsider, a federal agent whose authority meant nothing against the entrenched power of local tradition. If he was to uncover the truth, he would have to operate outside the sanction of the law he represented. The decision formed in his mind with a cold, clear logic. He had to get inside her house. He would wait for the next fair day, when the entire town, including Eliza May, would be gathered at the square, their attention fixed on the sizzling pans and the promise of a hot meal. The very event that was the stage for her success would provide him with the perfect window of opportunity to search the heart of her operation. The risk was enormous. A federal agent breaking into the home of a beloved local figure without a warrant was a career-ending or, if not life-ending, proposition in this part of the country. If caught, Sheriff Brody would have all the justification he needed to run him out of the parish, and the truth of Eliza May's enterprise would be buried forever beneath a mountain of local outrage. But the image of the splintered bone and the tarnished silver buckle was seared into Miller's mind. They were a silent mandate, a charge given to him from beyond the grave. He was no longer just investigating a series of disappearances. He was seeking justice for men who had been erased so completely that the world had not even registered their absence. This conviction steeled his resolve. He would become a trespasser in the name of a higher law. On the day of the fair, as the tinny music of the calliope drifted across the town, Miller made his move. He approached the house from the rear, slipping through the dense woods where Samuel had made his discovery. The house stood silent and unassuming, its windows like vacant eyes. A single wreath of dried flowers hung on the front door, a symbol of pious mourning. He found a kitchen window left slightly ajar, likely to air out the lingering smells of the morning's preparations. With the quiet skill of a cat burglar, he hoisted himself up and slipped inside, landing silently on the cool linoleum floor. The air inside was thick and still, carrying a strange tripartite scent. The sharp tang of industrial-grade bleach, the sweet decay of old wood, and beneath it all, a faint, cloying, meaty odor that clung to the very fabric of the house. The kitchen was a testament to meticulous, almost obsessive cleanliness. The cast-iron skillets hanging from hooks on the wall were seasoned to a perfect black sheen, free of any rust or residue. The wooden countertops, though old and scarred with countless knife marks, were scrubbed to a pale, almost white finish. A row of spice jars stood on a shelf, their labels neatly handwritten: sage, thyme, paprika, and a special unlabeled blend of darker more aromatic powders. It was the workspace of a master craftsman, a domestic sanctuary where the alchemy of cooking took place. But to Miller, the sterile environment felt less like a kitchen and more like a laboratory, or perhaps an operating theater after a procedure. The cleanliness was not just about hygiene. It was about the systematic erasure of evidence. He began a methodical search, his gloved hands moving through drawers and cupboards with practiced efficiency. He found nothing but the expected tools of a baker: rolling pins, flour sifters, and an array of well-honed knives, their blades sharpened to a razor's edge. The pantry was stocked with sacks of flour, jars of preserves, and large tubs of rendered lard. Everything was in its proper place, a portrait of domestic order. Yet, the oppressive feeling of wrongness grew with every passing second. The silence of the house seemed to press in on him, amplifying the sound of his own breathing. He felt like an archaeologist who had entered a pristine tomb, knowing that the sarcophagus in the center held a monstrous secret, if only he could find the key to unlock it. The key was not hidden in a secret compartment or buried under a loose floorboard. It was sitting in plain sight on a small writing desk in a corner of the kitchen, partially obscured by a stack of church bulletins. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover stained with grease and flour, indistinguishable from any ordinary book of household accounts or recipes. Miller's intuition, the finely tuned instrument of a born investigator, told him this was what he had been looking for. He carefully opened the book, the old leather creaking in protest. The first few pages were filled with legitimate recipes for pie crusts, apple preserves, and buttermilk biscuits, written in a delicate, looping cursive. It was a convincing facade, a layer of normalcy designed to deflect any casual inspection. As he turned the pages, however, the nature of the entries began to shift. Interspersed between a recipe for cornbread and notes on pickling vegetables, a new, more sinister format appeared. The entries were dated, beginning over 2 years ago. Each one started with a man's name or a crude descriptor. The first entry that caught his eye was chilling in its banality. Henry G., August 1931, cost, 2 weeks lodging, 14 meals, yield, 121 elbs, spices, heavy sage, black pepper. Miller felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. This was not a recipe book. It was a butcher's log. It was a detailed accounting of a human harvest, the transformation of men into a marketable commodity. Recorded with the dispassionate precision of a factory foreman, he scanned the subsequent entries, his horror mounting with each name. Jacob R., October 1932, yield, 112 lbs. Note, meat is stringy, requires longer simmering. And then, Silas T., April 1933, yield, 135 lbs. Excellent quality, raised pie price by 1 cent. The names from the missing persons files were all there, reduced to a set of cold, economic calculations. The ledger was a document of profound evil, not because of its violent content, but because of its utter lack of it. There was no mention of struggle, no hint of remorse or passion. The entries were written with the same detached, practical tone as the recipe for pie crust on the preceding page. For Eliza May, murder was not an act of rage. It was a matter of inventory management, a necessary step in her production line. The final pages of the ledger contained something even more disturbing. They were filled not with names, but with financial calculations. Eliza May had meticulously tracked her profits, calculating the cost of spices and flour against the revenue generated from her sales at the fair. She had noted the increase in customers during the leanest months of the Depression, correlating the town's growing desperation with her own rising income. It was the business plan for a monstrous enterprise. She had identified a surplus resource, the anonymous, unwanted men drifting through the country, and had converted it into a solution for the community's primary need: affordable food. In her cold, pragmatic worldview, she was not a murderer. She was a brilliant, if unorthodox entrepreneur who had achieved perfect vertical integration. This ledger was the Rosetta Stone to her crimes, a complete and detailed confession written in her own hand. It documented a system of predation that was as efficient as it was depraved. She lured the victims with the promise of shelter, processed them in her home, and then sold the final product back to the very community that revered her as a saint. The savory aroma that the town associated with comfort and survival was, in fact, the smell of their own neighbors being slowly consumed, their hunger sated by a horror they could not possibly imagine. Miller carefully photographed several pages of the ledger with a small, concealable camera he carried, creating a record of the evidence before placing the book exactly where he had found it. While Agent Miller was documenting these horrors, a subtle shift occurred across town at the fair. Eliza May, serving a fresh batch of pies to a long line of customers, paused. Her practiced, gentle smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her gaze drifted from the faces of the townsfolk toward the distant roofline of her own house, barely visible over the trees. No one in line noticed the change, but for a fleeting moment, the mask of the pious widow was replaced by the sharp, assessing glare of a predator. Something was wrong. Perhaps it was a curtain she had left open, now drawn shut, or a misplaced tool she noticed from afar. It was a detail too small for anyone else to perceive, but for a woman whose survival depended on meticulous control, it was a blaring alarm. The icy calm returned to her eyes. But it was now laced with a new element: calculation. She continued to serve her customers, her movements as fluid and efficient as ever, but her mind was racing. The federal man, Miller, he was the only dissonant element in her carefully orchestrated world, while the local sheriff was a known quantity, easily placated with a free pie and a kind word. This outsider was different. He did not eat her food. He did not respond to her southern charm. He only watched, his eyes missing nothing. She had dismissed him as a minor annoyance, a bureaucratic nuisance who would eventually move on. Now, she understood he was a genuine threat, one that was closing in far faster than she had anticipated. She was no longer just being observed. She was being hunted. Back in the silent, oppressive kitchen, Agent Miller slipped back out of the window, his heart pounding not with fear of capture, but with the weight of his discovery. He held in his mind the images of the ledger's pages, a testament to a form of evil so pragmatic and mundane it defied comprehension. He now had the proof he needed, a direct link between the missing men and the contents of Eliza May's famous pies. He had breached her fortress and stolen her darkest secret, but as he melted back into the cover of the woods, he had the distinct, chilling sensation of being watched. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the unseen observer. His intrusion had alerted his prey, and a creature like Eliza May, when cornered, would not be taken easily. The investigation had now entered its most dangerous phase. Miller possessed the truth, but it was a truth the town was not prepared to hear, and one the local sheriff would actively suppress. Eliza May, in turn, now knew she had an enemy. The quiet, methodical process of her grim business had been disturbed. The next move would be hers. The facade of the gentle, pious widow was about to crumble, revealing the ruthless and cunning predator that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The stage was set for a final, public confrontation, one that would force the town to look upon the true face of its beloved benefactor and confront the unspeakable nature of the meals they had so eagerly consumed. Miller made his way back to his rented room. The scent of Eliza May's kitchen, that unholy mixture of bleach and old meat, still clinging to his clothes. He developed the film in a makeshift darkroom, watching the images of the ledger's pages emerge in the chemical bath like ghosts materializing from the ether. Each photograph was a nail in Eliza May's coffin. He now had irrefutable, documentary evidence that would stand up in any court of law, far from the influence of Sheriff Brody and the deluded townsfolk. He was no longer relying on a statistical pattern or a child's discovery. He was holding the killer's own detailed confession, her business records of cannibalism. The time for subtlety and covert operations was over. It was time to bring the full weight of federal law down upon the small house on the edge of town. He knew that a direct assault on the house was still too risky. The sheriff would interfere, and Eliza May would have ample time to destroy the ledger and any other physical evidence. He needed a federal warrant, an official document signed by a judge that would override local authority and give him the power to conduct a thorough, unimpeachable search of the entire property. This would require contacting his superiors in Washington, a process that would take time and expose his unorthodox methods to scrutiny. As he prepared his report, he felt a new sense of urgency. He was not just building a case against a killer, he was in a race against her, a race to see if he could secure the warrant before she decided to eliminate the one person who knew her secret. The telegram from Washington arrived 2 days later, a thin piece of paper that carried the weight of the entire federal government. It was a federal warrant, signed by a district judge, granting Agent Thomas Miller full authority to conduct a comprehensive search of the property and person of one Eliza May Thompson. This document was more than legal permission. It was a shield against the obstinacy of Sheriff Brody and a sword against the town's collective denial. It transformed Miller from a meddling outsider into an instrument of federal justice, an unstoppable force descending upon this isolated Louisiana parish. He folded the paper and placed it in his breast pocket, the sharp creases a physical representation of the turning point he had just crossed. The time for observation was over. The time for excavation had begun, and he would dig until every last buried truth was brought into the harsh light of day. Accompanied by 2 grim-faced U.S. Marshals who had arrived on the same train as the warrant, Miller approached Eliza May's home at dawn. Sheriff Brody was already there, tipped off by the station master, his face a mixture of outrage and disbelief. "You can't do this, Miller," he blustered, attempting to block the path. "This is an abuse of power against a good woman." Miller simply produced the warrant. He did not need to speak. The official seal of the United States Department of Justice spoke for him, rendering the sheriff's local authority utterly impotent. Brody read the document, his face falling as he recognized his complete powerlessness. The protective bubble he and the town had built around Eliza May had just been burst by a single sheet of paper from a world far beyond his influence. He stepped aside, defeated, as the agents of the federal government walked past him and toward the front door. The initial search of the house proper yielded little. As Miller had observed during his illicit entry, the home was a monument to obsessive cleanliness. The marshals moved through the small rooms with professional detachment, checking under the sparse furniture, tapping walls for hollow spaces, and inspecting the fireplace for bone fragments. They found nothing. The kitchen, the epicenter of her ghastly enterprise, was as sterile as a surgeon's theater. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed one of the marshal's faces. He glanced at Miller, an unspoken question in his eyes. But Miller's resolve was absolute, forged by the cold, hard numbers in Eliza May's ledger. He knew the evidence was not in what could be seen, but in what was meticulously hidden. His attention turned from the house itself, to the ground beneath it, to the dark, earthen space where secrets in the rural South were so often kept. The root cellar was accessed by a heavy trapdoor in the floor of the pantry, a common feature in homes of that era. As they heaved it open, a wave of cool, damp air rose to meet them, carrying the earthy smell of potatoes and preserved goods. But underneath that wholesome scent was something else, a faint but persistent metallic tang, the ghost of an odor that no amount of bleach could entirely erase. Miller descended the rickety wooden steps first, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The cellar was small and cramped, lined with shelves of dusty mason jars filled with peaches, beans, and tomatoes. A perfect picture of rural self-sufficiency. It was another convincing facade. Miller ran his hand along the packed earth floor, his fingers searching for an inconsistency, a seam in the dirt that did not belong. He found it in the far corner, a section of the floor that felt harder, more uniform, than the rest. Beneath a thin layer of carefully scattered dirt was a secondary floor made of rough-hewn wooden planks. It was a false bottom, cleverly concealed and designed to go unnoticed during any cursory inspection. Using a crowbar, the marshals pried the planks loose, the sound of splintering wood echoing in the confined space. The stench that erupted from the void below was overwhelming, a putrid blast of decay so potent it caused the hardened lawmen to recoil. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, a thick, cloying miasma of old blood, chemical solvents, and rotting tissue that had soaked into the very soil. This was the true heart of Eliza May's operation, the hidden abattoir where her piety was washed away by a tide of methodical butchery. Miller covered his nose and mouth with a handkerchief and aimed his light into the darkness, revealing the source of the unspeakable smell. The secret chamber was a scene of industrial-scale horror. Heavy iron meat hooks hung from the low ceiling beams, their points sharpened and stained with a dark, permanent patina. In the center of the small space stood a massive, waist-high butcher's block, its wooden surface so deeply scarred and blackened with dried blood that its original color was impossible to discern. The ground around it was stained a deep, dark brown, evidence of countless gallons of fluid that had seeped into the earth. This was not a place of passionate, messy violence. It was a dismemberment facility, a cold, efficient workspace designed for the systematic processing of human bodies into manageable, marketable portions. The methodical nature of the setup was, in many ways, more terrifying than any random act of brutality. It spoke of a profound and chilling pragmatism. Lined up against one wall was an arsenal of tools that would have been the pride of any professional butcher. There were heavy cleavers with worn wooden handles, long-bladed boning knives, and a large frame saw designed for cutting through bone. Each tool was immaculately clean, wiped free of any fresh residue, but the steel of the blades was permanently tarnished, bearing the microscopic scars of their repeated, gruesome work. Near the tools were several large, galvanized metal tubs, the kind used for scalding hogs, and a heavy-duty meat grinder bolted to a small table. This was the final stage of the production line, the point where individual human identity was irrevocably destroyed, rendered into an anonymous uniform product ready to be mixed with flour, lard, and Eliza May's signature blend of southern spices. While federal agents were cataloging the instruments of her secret trade, the town fair was reaching its midday peak. The air was filled with the cheerful sounds of commerce and community, a stark counterpoint to the silent horror being unearthed just a few hundred yards away. Eliza May stood at her stall, the very picture of serene hospitality, ladling her famous pie filling into delicate crusts. The line before her was longer than ever, a testament to the town's hunger and their unshakable faith in her. She served each customer with her customary gentle smile, offering blessings with every purchase. The savory, meaty aroma of her cooking, the very scent that defined the fair, wafted over the square, a fragrant veil masking the monstrous truth that was about to be violently torn away. She was in her element, the queen of her domain, completely unaware that her reign was seconds from its end. The festive atmosphere fractured when Agent Miller and the two marshals emerged from the trees and began walking across the dusty square. Their progress was deliberate, their faces grim, parting the crowd like a ship's bow through water. The tinny music from the calliope seemed to falter and die. Laughter and conversation dwindled into confused murmurs. All eyes turned from the popular pie stall to the three approaching men of law. They did not stop until they stood directly in front of Eliza May's counter, casting a long, dark shadow over her sizzling pans. The entire fair held its breath. The sizzling of the lard in her skillet was suddenly the loudest sound in a square that had fallen into a profound and unnerving silence. Miller's voice, when he spoke, was not accusatory or emotional. It was cold, clear, and carried across the silent crowd with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Eliza May Thompson," he began, "you are under arrest for the murders of Henry Gable, Jacob Reed, and Silas Turner." He held up a clear evidence bag containing the tarnished silver eagle buckle for all to see. "And for the murders of at least 7 other men whose names we found recorded in your ledger." He gestured to the pies cooling on her counter. "We have found your kitchen, Miss Eliza May, your real kitchen." The accusation hung in the air, so monstrous, so utterly inconceivable, that the crowd's initial reaction was not horror, but a collective, confused denial. They looked from the stern-faced agent to the gentle widow, waiting for her to refute the insane charge. For a moment, Eliza May played the part she had perfected over years. Her eyes widened in shock, her hand flew to her chest in a gesture of wounded innocence. "Murder?" she cried, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "Sir, I am a God-fearing woman. How can you stand here and speak such blasphemy?" A wave of sympathetic murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Brody, who had followed the agents, stepped forward, ready to defend her. But Miller did not even glance at him. He kept his eyes locked on Eliza May, his gaze unblinking, filled with the certainty of a man who had already seen the absolute proof of her guilt. He did not need to argue. He just needed to wait for the real Eliza May to emerge from behind the mask. And then, something inside her broke. Perhaps it was the sight of the buckle, a trophy she thought was safely buried, or perhaps it was the agent's unwavering certainty, a force her charm could not deflect. But most likely, it was the sight of the townspeople's faces, their expressions of pity and disbelief. The pity she had curated for so long suddenly felt like an insult. Her posture changed. The trembling victim vanished, replaced by a rigid, defiant pride. A small, cold smile touched her lips. "He was a brute," she said, her voice dropping its gentle lilt, becoming flat and hard. "My husband, the first one, he deserved it. The others, well, times are hard. A woman must make her own way, and men are such a plentiful resource, aren't they? Always wandering, always unwanted." The confession, when it came, was not a torrent of remorse but a boastful lecture on her craft. Her hubris, the immense pride she took in her grotesque success, consumed her. "You have no idea the work that goes into it," she sneered, looking not at Miller but at the horrified faces of her customers. "The meat is tough, and it has a taste, overly sweet, almost cloying. You can't just use salt and pepper." She picked up her jar of special spices, holding it up as if presenting an award. "It takes a delicate balance of sage, cayenne, and 3 other herbs I will not name to mask the flavor properly, to make it taste like home, to make it taste like salvation." She looked directly at a woman in the front of the line who was still holding a half-eaten pie. "You all said it was the best you'd ever had." A wave of comprehension, followed by visceral, physical revulsion, swept through the crowd. A man in the front row doubled over, vomiting onto the dusty ground. A woman screamed, a raw, piercing sound of utter horror. The pie in the woman's hand dropped to the ground with a soft thud. The savory aroma that had been a source of comfort and celebration just moments before was now a nauseating trigger, the smell of death and cannibalism. They were not just witnesses to a confession, they were participants, their stomachs filled with the very evidence of her crimes. The idyllic town fair descended into a maelstrom of panic and disgust, the townsfolk scrambling away from her stall as if it were the altar of some unspeakable, demonic rite. Through it all, Eliza May stood perfectly still, a small, triumphant smile on her face as the marshals clamped the cold iron of the handcuffs around her wrists. The trial of Eliza May Thompson was not a local affair. It was a national spectacle. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco dispatched their most seasoned reporters to the small Louisiana parish, eager to chronicle every lurid detail of the cannibal widow of the bayou. The courtroom was packed daily with a morbidly curious public, while outside vendors sold cheap souvenirs and sensationalized pamphlets detailing her alleged crimes. The town, once a quiet pocket of rural anonymity, was now the unwilling epicenter of a media circus, its private shame broadcast across the nation as a grotesque form of entertainment. The very fabric of their community was dissected under the harsh glare of the public eye, and the townsfolk found themselves cast as unwitting extras in a real-life horror story, their simple faith and trust portrayed as naive foolishness on a national stage. This invasive scrutiny was a second violation, a public shaming that compounded the personal horror of their betrayal. In the witness box, Eliza May showed no remorse. Robbed of her pious facade, she embraced a new role, that of the misunderstood genius, the master of a dark and forbidden craft. She spoke of her methods with a chilling, instructional detachment, correcting the prosecutor on the finer points of butchery and seasoning. She described the unique challenges of her chosen protein, lecturing the horrified jury on the precise blend of herbs required to counteract the inherent sweetness of human flesh. Her testimony was not a confession born of guilt, but a final, defiant performance, a boastful demonstration of her superior intellect and pragmatism. In her own mind, she was not a monster, but a pioneer who had solved the fundamental economic problems of her time with unmatched efficiency. The court-appointed psychiatrist would later describe her as possessing a profound and incurable moral emptiness, a void where a conscience should have been. The revelations from the trial sent a shockwave of collective trauma through the community, from which it would never fully recover. The bonds of trust that held the small town together were irrevocably shattered. Every shared meal, every church potluck, every neighborly gesture was now tainted with a deep and pervasive suspicion. The simple act of accepting food from another's hand, once a cornerstone of Southern hospitality, became a source of profound anxiety. People who had known and defended Eliza May for years were consumed by a sickening mixture of guilt and self-loathing. They had not only been deceived, they had been made complicit in her atrocities, their hunger unwittingly fueling her murderous enterprise. The town's psyche was poisoned, and for a generation, a shadow of doubt would fall between even the closest of friends and neighbors. This psychological wound manifested in a deep, lasting culinary revulsion. The savory, meaty aroma that had once been the town's most celebrated scent became a trigger for nausea and panic. For years after the trial, the local butcher reported a dramatic decline in the sale of pork and other meats that could be ground or minced. The very concept of a meat pie became an object of local folklore and disgust. Families passed down the story not just as a cautionary tale about a specific woman, but as a broader, more visceral warning about the deceptive nature of appearances. The communal joy of eating was replaced by a private, lingering fear. Eliza May had not just murdered men, she had murdered the town's innocence, salting the earth of their traditions with the memory of an unspeakable ingredient. Eliza May's house, the site of her domestic abattoir, was seized by the federal government and stood empty for years, a decaying monument to the horror it once contained. Locals avoided it, and children would dare each other to run up and touch the rotting porch steps before fleeing in terror. It became a nexus for ghost stories, with tales of strange lights in the windows and the faint, sweet smell of cooking meat lingering on the humid night air. Eventually, the town council, in a desperate attempt to excise the physical reminder of her crimes, had the structure torn down and burned in a great pyre. But the land itself was considered cursed, and no one ever built upon the vacant lot. It remains empty to this day, a patch of overgrown weeds and wildflowers on the edge of town, a silent testament to the secrets buried in its soil. As the years turned into decades, the historical facts of Eliza May's case began to soften and blur, slowly crystallizing into the hard, sharp edges of a legend. The woman, Eliza May Thompson, faded from living memory, replaced by the myth of Miss May, a supernatural bogeyman who snatched away misbehaving children and outsiders who wandered too far from the main road. The story shed its specific details, the names of the victims, the date of the trial, and became a timeless piece of regional folklore. It was a story told around campfires and on dark, stormy nights, a narrative that served to reinforce the community's insular nature and its deep-seated suspicion of strangers. The gruesome reality of her crimes was transformed into a powerful cultural artifact, a story that would haunt the town far more effectively than any ghost. Agent Thomas Miller, the man who had brought the darkness into the light, found his career accelerated by the high-profile case. He was lauded in Washington as a brilliant and tenacious investigator, yet the victory was a hollow one. The things he had seen in Eliza May's cellar, and the cold, pragmatic evil he had heard in her courtroom testimony, left an indelible mark on his soul. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. He continued his work for the Bureau for another 2 decades, but those who knew him said he was a changed man, quieter, more withdrawn, forever haunted by the memory of the sweet, savory smell that had masked an unimaginable horror. He had brought justice to the forgotten men, but he could never fully scrub the stain of that Louisiana parish from his own mind. The ultimate question of Eliza May's nature remains unanswered, a subject of debate for criminologists and local historians alike. Was she a victim of a brutal, patriarchal society, a woman pushed to monstrous acts by the abuse of her first husband and the desperation of the Great Depression? Or was the chaos of the era simply the perfect camouflage for a predator who had been lying dormant all along? Her ledger suggests a cold, calculating mind driven by profit, yet her first murder was an act of self-preservation. Perhaps the truth is that she was both, a victim who, upon discovering her own capacity for violence, found it not only liberating but profitable, transforming her personal trauma into a grotesque business model. She remains a chilling enigma, a testament to the complex and often terrifying ways in which circumstance and character can conspire to create a monster. Decades later, the fairgrounds are still a feature of the town, though smaller now, a pale echo of their former vibrancy. The spot where Eliza May's stall once stood is conspicuously empty, a patch of bare earth where the grass refuses to grow. On cool October evenings, when the wind blows just right, some say you can still catch a faint, ghostly aroma drifting from that barren patch of ground, savory, meaty, and unnervingly sweet. It is here that the legend lives on most vividly. The town's children, emboldened by youthful bravado, sometimes dare each other to approach the cursed spot after dusk. They stand at its edge, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination, as one of them inevitably whispers the warning passed down through generations: never take food from a stranger, especially if their pies smell a little too good. The official records of Eliza May Thompson's case are now brittle, archived documents, gathering dust in a federal vault. But the story itself, the chilling legend of the pie maker, has proven far more durable, a dark stain on the region's history that refuses to fade. It serves as a permanent, unsettling reminder that the most profound horrors are often not the ones that lurk in distant, shadowy places, but those that hide in plain sight, concealed behind a neighbor's smile and the comforting aroma of a home-cooked meal. To ensure these chilling chapters of our history are never erased from the collective memory, subscribe to our channel and help us preserve the archive of the shadows.